I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. With us once again, a best-selling author. Before that, she was a managing director at Goldman, a high-ranking person at Goldman Sachs. And you have to have people come in here who have been on the inside, who know what's going on with big, global finance, and tell us what's going on. I'm talking about Nomi Prins. Nomi Prins, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you so much, Greg.
The paperback version of your best-selling book, All the President's Bankers, is out. Just wanted to give you that little thing. I mean, the original book is, this is a big book, folks. I mean, there's 70 pages of what do you call it? References in here and notes and stuff. And here's, of course, the original beautiful hardback cover book. But the paperback book is out, and I just wanted to put that up there. We'll put a link at the end of this interview for the cheaper, lighter version of your honkin' book, which is a beautiful thing about all the presidents, bankers, back to Teddy Roosevelt. Let's talk about the global economy. The last time you were on, you were worried about the systems breaking down. Give us an update of your thesis of what's going on with the economy right now.
Yeah, what I had said last time and sort of a couple times before that is that, we've seen an enhanced amount of volatility in the markets. We have these up and down, triple-digit moves in stock prices and so forth. That's indicative of things beginning to come apart on that level, because what it means is there's a fear of capital being available and coming into the system. That said, there is still cheap capital available and coming into the system because quantitative easing and zero or negative interest rate policy is still globally prevalent. Yes, it is officially stopped in the United States. The Fed is officially not buying any more bonds, but the banks have stepped in to buy the extra bonds. So for all practical purposes, quantitative easing continues here, as does, of course, zero interest rate policy. Capital is available. Of course, the ECB just announced and has begun commencing their next version. They've already been in quantitative easing, so that continues to happen as well. But, of course, there's the fear that at some point there is just no powder left in that gun, if that's the right metaphor, and at some point it will go down. And the volatility that we're beginning to see is indicative of that coming apart, that there's nothing else that's been propping up the markets, and that when there's nothing left to prop up the markets are going to come apart. It still hasn't happened yet, but the enhanced volatility is a sign that we're moving towards that direction. It's been kept apart by artificial forces for just too long.
Little Greece is back in the news. I mean, this past, last week, their finance minister actually blurted out that we're not going to pay this money back. What? And then you have the EU telling them, hey, don't pay your wages for your workers for a month or two. I mean, this is brutal. I mean, they want their money.
The policies against Greece and the whole idea of austerity for debt has been horrific. It continues to be horrific. But what we have to do, are those of us who think about it, not those of us who just have the power to basically try and push down countries like Greece or individuals, who lack the capacity of some of the power of elite in any country, is that the whole reason that the bailout, the debt was imposed upon Greece was so that it could pay back its creditors, so that it could pay back those speculators from the international economy through the international banking system that had decided to bet on Greece. It wasn't necessarily that Greece couldn't pay its debt in terms of running a country. What it was having difficulty paying is running a country when all the money that had, the hot money, the speculation that had come into Greece came out during the beginning of the financial crisis in 2008. So the solution that the powers that be, that the Troika came up with, was to dump all this impossible to pay. And they knew it was impossible to pay. Years later, the IMF said it was a bad deal for Greece, debt onto Greece. And in return for that, asked Greece to basically stop, cut paying its workers, reduce programs, and basically create a really horrible situation for the country and for people on the ground, which, surprise, surprise, has continued to get worse because it was never going to be a good situation to begin with. Now, on the other hand, what's going on? Well, Greece is saying, look, we don't want to pay this back, not because they're a deadbeat country, but because the terms to begin with were absolutely awful. They were awful for Greece. They would be awful for anyone. They were loan shark terms to one of the member countries of the EU. That's what they were. That is what they still are. And that's what's trying to be extracted from the powers that be from Greece. And Greece is saying, look, the terms, the availability of us to actually repay not just debt, but debt on these terms was and continues to be impossible. Meanwhile, the ECB, while trying to stamp Greece further into the ground, is buying covered bonds from Deutsche Bank. It has the money or the availability to create the money to buy bonds, but it
prop
doesn't
up Deutsche Bank, who's deeply into, I don't know, 74.5 trillion in derivative. I mean, whoa, which is what 20-something times the German economy. I mean, it's really leveraged. And they didn't do well, even in this phony, I call it phony stress test, where all the banks, except for two, Santander and I think, I mean, come on, you can't. How do you have that big of a debt overhang and all these other banks with these derivative overhangs? Is the stress test? Is number one, is Deutsche Bank in trouble, or are they just going to keep too big to fail, propping them up no matter what, at the risk of countries, Greece, Portugal, Spain? We don't care about you, but we do care about Deutsche Bank. Is that what they're going to do?
That is what they're currently doing. I mean, the situation is that Deutsche Bank, Citigroup, JP Morgan, all of these banks have been subsidized by quantitative easing. They've been subsidized by a combination of central bank and government policy. This is a power policy. It's not an intelligent economic policy. It's not for the benefit of people on the ground. But these banks, because they are so connected to their governments, there are identities that are fused. These mega banks, which is the biggest bank in Germany. JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, they're the biggest banks, part of the big six banks in the United States. These banks are the identity of political power as well as financial power, and the central banks have basically come in over the last more than half a decade to sustain them. So that's what's happening now. The ECB, which already had its quantitative program in place, as we mentioned, is continuing to prop up Deutsche Bank by buying covered bonds from them, and BNP, and ING. And yes, all of these banks have mega derivatives positions, as do the U.S. banks, which are also being propped up. They're being propped up by the Fed having bought asset-backed and mortgage-backed securities. The ECB is buying covered bonds. They're the same thing. They're manufactured bonds by these banks, and when the ECB or Fed buys them, in return, they receive capital, and they can use that capital to leverage derivatives positions. This has been the game that has been going on basically since and before the financial crisis. It started without subsidization from the central banks and governments, and now it has continued with subsidization by the central banks and governments.
That's how we say, what could go wrong? And really, what could go wrong with this type of policy? What could go wrong with the derivative market? I mean, isn't that the scariest component, which most people don't know much about? They don't even talk about it. Ooh, CNBC, ooh. They don't really talk about that. But, I mean, this is hundreds of trillions of dollars, and you don't need a big move, and I'm not a banker like you, but I do understand when you have 100-to-1 leverage or 50-to-1 leverage, you don't need a wrong move, much of a wrong move to blow you out of the water. Am I wrong?
No, you're completely right. And you mentioned before the stress test, and one of the reasons they're so bad is they don't understand. They're actually manufactured in association with these banks to not understand or to avoid the fact that derivatives positions are codependent. When we say there's hundreds of trillions of dollars of derivatives positions outstanding, the term for that is notional, but what it really means is the potential risk is that big. Now, what banks say is, no, that's not the risk. That's just the face amount of the risk. What's really happening here is we have a very small risk, and we're managing that because we're hedging it, we're offsetting it with other derivatives positions. The reality is that works when it works. And when those positions are not able to be offset anymore, or one bank completely plummets because of some very bad set of derivatives bets, whether that's a currency bet, whether that's a commodities bet, whether that's a interplay between foreign exchange type of bets, whether it's a country-to-country bet, whatever it is, whether it's a stack bet where one derivative has multiple components, as many of them do, if one thing goes wrong, it leaks into the entire system. That's always been the danger. If we just go back to the subprime crisis, which is like kind of in rear view mirrors, but was really prevalent today. I mean, we looked at a financial system that fell apart, for which the Federal Reserve has $4.5 trillion on its book to try to preserve, and the ECB is like moving up to those numbers for a similar situation in Europe. That preservation is because of only basically, a $500 billion worth of subprime loans. that created multiple trillions and years worth of preservation because they were so leveraged and there were so many derivatives attached to them and they were so codependent that when a small piece of them fell apart, all that implosion happened. And we are still paying for that. And that was just one asset class.
And could that happen? Could that happen again?
And it could absolutely happen again. One thing none of these stress tests does is stack up all of these banks. They look at these individual banks and they say, fill out this. What happens if, unemployment goes this high, and if, your cost of funding goes this high, and if, some of your positions, some of your loans go undervalued to this extent. There's all these sort of like fake parameters that are not really based on this idea that if one domino falls, all of them fall. And that domino effect, whether, again, it's for countries, for currencies, for commodities, for whatever it may be, is not part of these stress tests. It's like it didn't happen. And it's like there's no imagination in these tests as to what could happen when multiple dominoes fall at the same time. So that remains in the system.
So when you see these headlines that, the banks are flush, I think the USA Today headline last week, the banks are flush with cash, they passed their stress test, only 2 were bad. And you say to that, well, only Lehman went down. I mean, you saw how well this netting effect, this backup, bilateral netting or whatever you call it, you saw how well, they had this notional value, how well it worked with Lehman Brothers. And, boy, we might have, multiple Lehman Brothers. If that happens, could we wake up one day and find out that, wow, our money, our bonds, our retirement, that's gone. Poof, bye.
Well, the difference is today, again, relative to Lehman Brothers, is that we have many trillions of dollars and government policy trying to basically cover up the holes in the entire financial system that could create another Lehman or multiple Lehman. So we have this kind of whitewashing. There's a hole in the wall. It's been plastered over many, many, many times. The hole is still there. The danger is still there. The codependency is still there. The leverage is still there. So, of course, in addition, the banks now have extra capital, and with this extra capital, they are passing these like faux tests with flying colors, or some of them, like Deutsche, are still failing them. But the reality is that's capital that's been basically given to them in return for certain assets, certain bonds that these central banks are buying for them. So, of course, they are flush with capital. They're not using it for smart, productive, economically beneficial to the rest of the population endeavors. They are sitting on it or they're leveraging on it. So it looks like they have more because, they have had the availability of that capital through these zero interest and negative interest rate programs and quantitative easing programs. It looks good on the surface. That's just the surface.
How bad does Deutsche Bank have to be? It just hit me. For them to have all this help that you're talking about and all this bond buying these covered bonds, how bad do they have to be to still fail their phony stress test? How bad does Deutsche Bank have to be?
Yeah, bad. I mean, again, these stress tests don't even look at codependencies in their leveraged derivatives positions. I mean, so given that there's no doubt those exist, inside Deutsche's book relative to ING, BNP, JP Morgan, they all kind of work together. They're all on similar trades. They are at any given moment. Maybe not at the same time directionally, but also we're all in the same global financial market. I think they're pretty bad. They probably have a lot of hemorrhaging loans still. Europe, obviously, in its totality, is doing poorly. Yes, it looks like some of the major countries, the more powerful countries like Germany, are doing a little bit better than countries like Greece or Italy, which is doing better than it's been doing, but not really. I mean, it all looks like there's been this cosmetic shift to, supporting these banking institutions rather than supporting from the bottom up the economies of these countries. And that has the effect of creating deterioration in any of the assets that these banks still are financing. And so when those deteriorate, whether they're businesses, whether they're the individual loans that still exist, whatever they may be, whether people can't pay back the debts that they have, all of that's happening at the same time, and you cannot cover all of that. And then if you add to that any type of a major risk type of a trade, any type of a more betting trade that doesn't relate to actually funding or lending some of that capital and expecting interest or capital come back to those institutions, that creates a larger problem. So you got weak economies, you got plastering over with the buying of securities. Buying securities does not help people get jobs. It does not help industries continue to innovate. It does absolutely nothing for spreading a foundation of solid economics throughout the population. All it does is make banks look better and cover these holes. And when we see that even with all that, holes continue to sort of pop up and be visual, that indicates a much larger problem.
Well, when you talk about the bottom up, I mean, what's your thoughts on this? The third, I was talking to Greg Manarino, and he said, "Whoa, retail sales, third month in a row, boom, in the tank." And they keep telling us the economy is good, and the banks are flush with cash, and we have low unemployment. But is that your take on the economy, or is what you just said? The economy is weak. Is it getting weaker? And could that be, this declining retail sales? These, all these people on food stamps. Could that knock the banks out of the box at some point?
It could create a new cascade of business and individual loans for whatever they may be for, or credit not being paid back, because what's happened, people don't have money. So even if the headline unemployment looks decent, the reality is that the jobs that are being created do not pay well. They don't necessarily have benefits, which means people are digging into their pockets for, whether it's healthcare, whether it's college, or whether it's extra food, or whether it's for utilities or gas money on their car, which some companies used to pay and now they don't. Whatever it might be, all of those things are now coming out more and more out of people's pockets, and that's for the people that are supposedly contributing to this lowered headline unemployment number, but the reality is those jobs aren't really paying. So people don't have any money. Greg, I just did a drive back and forth across the United States on the I-10, bottom part of the I-10 for 5,000 miles back and forth, 100 hours. And one of the things I noticed was there's like a lot. There's a lot of stuff for lease. There's a lot of stuff for sale. There's a lot of really, bad conditions on many cities and that's a sign, on the ground. I mean, there's the statistics that sort of accumulate things, but on the ground, there's a lot of suffering. And at the top, at the bank level, because they have all this free capital, and people are buying, the central banks are buying their assets, and they can use their larger corporate customers to give them some debt, and that debt goes into the stock market goes up. All of this is upper level puffy stuff. It isn't anything that's really substantiating, solidifying, the economic base of any country. And so that, at some point, again, is going to peak through. Because we haven't fixed anything. We don't really have anything more solid than we had in 2007. We just have this plastering over. It's there. It's just the plaster job has been really, really good. It's been really, really good. It has been looking like it works on the surface. It's put capital in the pockets of banks. It's made the stock markets go up. Most of the media is on that story as well. Economy's good, blah, blah, blah. GDP is up, blah, blah, blah. But from a global economic perspective, a global financial markets perspective, although out of this is manufactured capital. It's not necessarily sustainable or long-term. And to the extent that small businesses, medium businesses, individuals have to be a part of this economy because, we exist, we don't necessarily have collectively the ability to sustain a fake economy.
You and Catherine Austin Fitz, the two of the ladies that I have on here, both nailed 2014 when everybody else is saying, we're worried about the end of the year and everything will crash. You and her gave very low percentage that things could crash. I mean, yes, there could always be a black swan. Both of you were uniform in that. You said 2014, we'll make it. It'll be fine. We have a very small percentage. Boom, right on, and right on. Both you and Catherine Austin Fitz. When I interviewed Catherine Austin Fitz at the late last year, beginning of this year, she was like, maybe 40% chance that things could fall out of bed. I mean, boy, that went from a few percent to a big increase. I mean, it's a big increase. Are you also worried about the big increase in the possibility of things falling out of bed? A lot of people, big money people, are worried about the economy melting down this fall. And that the clouds and stars are going to align for either a big fat honkin' war or a big market crash, or both sequentially something. What's your view on when the cold, hard reality of the real economy meets the fantasy world of the banks?
Yeah, well, again, a few years ago I would have said we were crashing around the corner, but this whole plaster job, again, has been so much better than I think any of us could have imagined, that viewing how that has evolved has really also, altered how we think of all of this. Which is why last year, because we still had banks taking over the QE of the Fed, ECB coming on, all of that was what kept everything cosmetically intact. We still have some of that this year. But what we also have, and what I mentioned last time we talked, is that we have this volatility increasing. We have these up and down spikes. And we also are getting to the end of the ECB keg. The Bank of Japan can come in with a couple of things. There's a couple of things that some of the other central banks can do. But in terms of mass announcements of buying, mass buying, all of that, it is coming to an end this year. And I think that the actual end, not the Fed announcing tapering when the global community is still buying, or the banks are still buying, but when an actual end appears, that's when things start to fall out. When there is no artificial external buyer for debt, that's when things start to fall apart. And this extra volatility is really showing that we're going in that direction for real. So it's not going to be tomorrow. I don't know that it's going to be in the summer. I think we could see the volatility increasing into the fall, and I think we could see some really significant drops in the fall. And then I think really into the election, I think we're going to see some even bigger drops. So I think it's going to be a sort of not necessarily crash off the cliff, but more volatility to the downside, which is I think what I said last time, as we continue throughout the year and as these last sort of bits of quantitative easing, of artificial propping up of markets lose their, just stop.
Nomi Prins, thanks for coming on and giving us a inside banker's education about a perspective, I should say, about what's going on. Your best-selling book, All the President's Bankers, out in paperback. It's cheaper, it's lighter, it's still just as good. Thank you very much, Nomi Prins, for coming on today and joining us on USAWatchdog.com.
Thank you.